Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on PMI's Ethical Decision-Making Framework. In this lesson, we cover PMI's Ethical Decision-Making Framework and how it is meant to be used to apply the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct to everyday decision-making in your projects. It provides a structured approach to analyzing some difficult situations and helping you to decide on a course of action. And in this lesson, we'll also cover some specific examples of using the decision-making framework. The ethical decision-making framework is not a requirement, but it is a useful guideline and series of steps that you can follow to help you in your ethical decision-making. The framework is a guideline that basically consists of 5 steps, and each step has a series of suggested questions that you should ask yourself as you go through each of these 5 steps. These steps are assessment, alternatives, analysis, application, and action. Although these are presented in a specific order, and you'll generally go through them in this order, you may iterate through these just as you do with your project management processes. You may go back and forth and revisit previous steps as needed. And there may be other steps that you could introduce that would be useful. These are the 5 that are presented as this guideline. In the assessment step, you make sure that you have all of the facts. Once you are sure that you have all the facts, then you move to the alternatives step, in which you identify and consider your choices. The analysis step is when you identify a candidate decision amongst all of your different choices, and then test the validity of your candidate decision. In the application step, you apply some ethical principles to this candidate decision to make sure that it still holds up. And then in the action step, you take those last steps needed to then make a decision and take action. In the first step of assessment, you can ask yourself questions such as these. Does it abide by the law? If not, you should seek some legal counsel. Does it align with the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct? Does it agree with your employer's and client's Code of Ethics and Conduct? Does it align with your ethical values and those of the surrounding culture? If you can get through these questions and answer yes to all of them, and you're comfortable with these answers, then you can proceed to the next step of considering your alternatives. If not, you should go back and find the answers to these questions. You should go back and gather more information to make sure you understand all of the facts. The second step is to consider your alternatives. You should list all of the different alternatives you can think of and ask yourself if you've listed all of them. And for all of these alternatives, you should consider the pros and cons for each possible choice. You should continue in this step until you're satisfied that you have considered all of the possible alternatives and their pros and cons. Once you've listed the alternatives and pros and cons, you then proceed to the analysis step, in which you choose one of these alternative choices and put it through these analysis questions. Will your candidate decision have a positive impact or prevent harm to project managers, PMI staff or volunteers, clients, your employer's organization, the environment, or future generations? Will it take cultural differences into account? Looking back on this decision, will this seem like a good idea a year from now? Are you confident that you are free from any external influence in making this decision? And are you in a calm and unstressed state of mind? If you consider all of these types of questions and you're satisfied that this is still a good candidate decision, then you can move on to the next step. If not, you should probably go back to your list of alternatives and try another one and run a different alternative through the analysis process. In the application step, you consider what it would be like to actually apply this decision by asking yourself questions like, would your choice result in the greatest good? Would your choice treat others as you would like to be treated? And would your choice be fair and beneficial to all concerned? If answering these questions makes you uncomfortable, or you don't feel like you can answer yes to all of these questions, then you may need to go back and reconsider your decision. You may need to go back as far as to the original first step of this process, which is the assessment step, and then go through the alternatives and analysis again in exploring your options and the implications of these different options until you can come to this step and answer yes to these types of questions. The final step is action. And in this step, you ask yourself some questions about whether or not you're ready to take action. For example, are you willing to accept responsibility for your decision? Could you make your decision public and feel good about it? And are you ready and prepared to act? If you can answer yes to these questions, then you can proceed to act on this decision. If not, you may need to go back one or more steps, perhaps again all the way to the beginning, to review your options and analyze them and choose one that you can answer yes to on all of these questions. To review, the PMI Ethical Decision-Making Framework consists of 5 steps: assessment, alternatives, analysis, application, and action. Assessment is making sure that you have all of the facts about this particular ethical dilemma or question that you face. Alternatives is where you consider your choices. Analysis is when you identify your candidate decision and test its validity. Application, you apply some ethical principles to your candidate decision. And then in action, you make a decision and then act on it. Let's apply this framework now to one of the more difficult ethical questions, and that is about bribery. Bribery is when you provide some sort of payment in exchange for some influence or advantage or some unethical behavior, typically from a government official or other representative. However, it's not always easy to tell what is and what is not bribery. Depending on who you talk to or which sources you consult, they'll provide you with different definitions of bribery. And bribery is not illegal in all countries. And in many countries, bribery is illegal and yet still commonly practiced. Also, it can be difficult to determine what is legitimate payment in exchange for something versus bribery. For example, if you're purchasing something online and you decide to upgrade from standard shipping to next day shipping, you've now paid for some advantage. You get something sooner. But that's not considered bribery. You could also upgrade from coach tickets to first class tickets. And you've paid to do that. But that's not considered bribery. Even for things like renewing your passport, which normally can take a few weeks, you can pay an expediting fee to get that turned around in 2 days. And there are other examples of government agencies that will process your applications in an expedited manner in exchange for a fee. But none of these are considered bribery. As you can see, you need to be careful not to assume that something is bribery just because it's payment in exchange for some advantage to you. You'll need to consult with your corporate policies and management, perhaps your PMO, and maybe even seek legal counsel in order to get a decision about whether or not an ethical dilemma you face is considered bribery or not. Now let's take a look at an example and use the decision-making framework with it. Robert and Chad are both PMP certified project managers, currently managing projects in a country in which bribery is commonplace and generally accepted. Local laws against it are rarely enforced. Robert learns that Chad has paid a local government officer to expedite the process of obtaining the necessary permits. Robert is new to the country and knows that he will soon face the same situation on his project. What should Robert do? Without taking the framework into consideration, you might immediately come up with a few alternatives, such as go ahead and make the payment, or refuse to make the payment. You might also consider reporting Chad to the company, or even to PMI. However, before we make such an important decision, let's go through PMI's ethical decision-making framework. It starts with assessment. Make sure you have all the facts. Then you move on to alternatives in which you consider your choices and the pros and cons of these choices. And then analysis, in which you identify a candidate decision and test it. And then apply ethical principles, and then make a decision on an action. Assessment. Let's make sure we have all the facts. It can be valuable to ask yourself, what do you not know? In this example, we know that Robert learns that Chad has paid a local government official to expedite the process of obtaining the necessary permits. What you don't know is whether this is a legitimate, legal expediting payment, like expediting your passport or faster shipping. Or is it a bribe to influence a decision? Is this particular payment legal in this country? And is it against the company's policy? We don't have the answers to these questions. We know we don't have all the facts yet, so we can't move on to the next steps in the framework and come to a decision. So what should you do next? Well, let's suppose this was a question on the PMP exam and that these were the possible answers. A. Make the payment. The fact that it is customary and fairly applied to all makes it a normal cost of doing business in that country. B. Meet with Chad to learn the details. Seek advice from the company's leadership and legal counsel. C. Report Chad to PMI for violation of the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. It is a clear case of bribery which is against the PMI Code of Ethics. Or D. Meet with Chad to learn the details of the process so that he is prepared when it's time for him to obtain the necessary permits for his project. It is not optional in order to do business in the country, so it is acceptable. Now look at each of these and ask yourself which of these best fit your current situation. You know you shouldn't do A and C because those are some pretty serious decisions that shouldn't be made until you get through the whole framework. B and D both fit better the idea that we don't know all the facts and we need to learn more of the facts. But which of these is the better answer? The best answer is B, Because we don't have all of the information yet, we need to consult with Chad, company leadership, and legal counsel. We can't jump to the conclusion like we do in D to assume that this is an acceptable business practice. Let's try out this framework with another example. Robert is a PMP certified project manager, hired as an external consultant to manage a software development project for a global mining company. The project is in the early stages of development. He discovers that the scope of work that it was agreed upon is far from sufficient to meet the needs of the customer, and the customer is clearly not aware of the discrepancy. He approaches the PMO manager, and she tells him to proceed with the project as planned and not to discuss his concerns with the customer. What should Robert do? Remember the steps. Assessment, make sure you have all the facts. Alternatives, consider your choices and their pros and cons. Analysis, identify your candidate decision and test it. Application, apply some ethical principles. And action, make a decision. The first step is assessment. Let's make sure we know all the facts. Let's assume that Robert does some research and finds that the PO manager is not PMP certified. So the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct does not apply to the PMO manager. However, it does apply to Robert. So he needs to consider responsibility. You've got the client to consider, the commitments that have been made, and you have some errors to deal with. Respect, in this case, is about the personal property, in this case money, of the client in doing this project. Fairness, you've got a transparency problem because the PMO manager does not want to be transparent. And the last of the 4 values of the Code of Ethics, honesty. In this case, the PMO manager is asking Robert to withhold information, which violates the honesty value. Now that we've done the assessment and we have the facts, we move on to the alternatives step. And here are some possible alternatives. You could just keep quiet. Resign without explanation. Resign with a letter to the customer explaining the situation. Resign with a letter to the company's legal counsel explaining the situation. Or you could consult with legal counsel. Report the PMO manager to the HR department. Report the PMO manager to PMI. Or explain the Code of Ethics to the PMO manager and seek some sort of resolution. Now for the analysis step. You can pick one candidate decision or you could pick a few and run these through these questions and see whether or not you feel that this is going to have a positive impact on everyone involved. Some of these alternatives don't. Does it take cultural differences into account? Not really applicable here. Looking back, will you feel good about this decision in a year? Some of these don't look like they would. Are you free from external influence in making this decision? That's a tough one. And in some cases, you might be under some external influence, such as the fact that your contract and your income depends upon this project, and you may be concerned that by speaking up, you could risk that employment. And are you in a calm and unstressed state of mind? In the application step, you ask whether or not this choice would result in the greatest good, whether you're treating people the way you'd like to be treated, and whether it's fair and beneficial to everyone. Are you willing to accept responsibility? Can you make this decision public and still feel good about it? And are you ready to act? As you go through these steps with different candidate decisions, you'll find that this last one is your best option at this point. To try and sit down with the PMO manager and explain the Code of Ethics that you're bound to and how important it is to you and see if you can seek some sort of resolution with the PMO manager that doesn't violate the Code of Ethics. To summarize, what should you know about the PMI Ethical Decision-Making Framework? You should know how to apply it. You should know the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. You should also apply some critical thinking and consider your alternatives. And you need to remember that you need to be active, not passive. Project managers need to always be proactive in all of their decisions and actions. For more information, you can go to pmi.org and download the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, the PMI Ethical Decision-Making Framework, as well as an excellent article called Do the Right Thing, which covers the issue of bribery. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.